Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Marilena Zambara. I'm actually in my first year of my PhD pursuit, and I'm quite happy to present to you the work that I've been involved in, and that Daniel was so kind to introduce. It's actually, as Daniel said, a continuation of what you have just observed, in the sense that Daniel has managed to solve a large-scale capacity expansion planning problem under uncertainty. So now what this presentation is going to be about, we're going to introduce a specific expected energy not served constraints to this large-scale problem. So we're going to see what are the issues that are being introduced when we do that, and what is our methodology to tackle it. Okay, so let me first introduce a little bit the problem. So, and put this into context. So what you can, I'm okay, thank you. So what you can see here is actually a snapshot from the latest European Resource Adequacy Assessment that Danielle already introduced. So you can see the adequacy risk for a certain year in the future, 2033 in particular. So, okay, the larger the blue dot, the higher the risk. So it's actually the more hours that load had to be curtailed. Okay, so I believe a natural question is, so what is an optimal investment plan in order to eliminate these blue dots, or if not eliminating them, keeping them within certain limits, for example. So how to meet certain reliability criteria. Okay, so is this a trivial question? Actually, it is not, at least as long as optimality is within scope. So there are inherent difficulties in approaching this problem, and in the literature there have been proposed approaches, of course, a lot of them based on Bender decomposition. But in general, what we see is that they are implemented in models that are definitely smaller in size, and for example, a model as large as the whole of Europe, or we see that they are combined with some scenario reduction techniques, or maybe even they evaluate reliability, they consider reliability only for a worst case scenario. So if we want to tackle this for a large scale model and for a lot of scenarios, then at least from a research perspective, there is something to say here. Okay, so I want to relate just a little bit what this work is about relative to the ERA. So Daniel mentioned, but I will also repeat here, that the ERA is a two-step approach. So every step answers a different question, and different from each other and different from what we are asking in this work. So the first step is the economic viability assessment, the EVA, which basically is it amounts to solving a large capacity expansion problem for a large number of scenarios. So it answers the question, how capacity will evolve? Considering some assumptions, well, how we expect the capacity to evolve. This is the first step of the ERA. And then comes the second step that calculates the adequacy metrics, considering as given this capacity plan. So it answers the question, will this be enough? So, okay, what this work is about, we are integrating specific constraints on expected energy not served on the EVA. And we are answering a new question. So how should capacity evolve in order to be enough? Okay, so I'm going to start introducing the problem and the proposed solution. I'm actually going to be using a very simplified minimal number of equations. So you can view this as a very minimum, let's say, EVA. Okay, so what we have, we're minimizing investment and expected operation cost and expected cost of load shedding, priced at VOLA in this particular example, subject to power generation constraints and load balance constraints. Just note that the omega index is used for scenario, G for generator, T for time. So, okay, some notes here. This has no reliability constraints, so actually consideration of reliability is implicit. I mean, load shedding is limited because there is a cost element in the objective function. Now this problem is very nicely formulated into two stages. The first stage being investment, so basically it regards variables that are not let's say indexed by scenario, and then the second stage involves the operation. It involves the constraints and the variables that are indexed by omega. Basically, every generation constraint there is a separate constraint for every scenario for generation, a separate one for load balance. And basically, there is nothing bundling scenarios with each other in this formulation here. So Daniel has talked a lot on that. There are ways to tackle this. Daniel has proposed a method to tackle a large-scale version of this. Very generally speaking, we could, for example, have a trial X, and given that X, we can solve in parallel the scenario-specific models, retrieve some information in order to update X, and this is a standard, let's say, solution strategy for this. So let's see what happens when we introduce reliability constraints. So you can see reliability constraint would be of the form expected value across all scenarios of total load shedding being less or equal to a limit. Okay, so as soon as we introduce this, then there's no need for the cost element in the objective function. So this is our problem. This is what we are trying to tackle. I'm calling it F, and we are looking for F star. Okay, so here representation is explicit, right? Load shedding is limited by specific constraints, but reliability constraints bundle all the scenarios. So here is the difficulty. We cannot implement a decomposition technique directly as we would if we didn't have them. Okay, so what we propose to do here is to relax the reliability constraints. So let's see what Lagrange relaxation yields here. So if I introduce as lambda the shadow price of the EENS constraints, then this will lead us this will introduce the cost of violating the EENS constraint, and we will have the Lagrange dual functions. So we have defined function g of lambda, and we know from duality theory that actually if we find the lambda that maximizes g of lambda is actually giving us what we want, the solution that we want. So the good thing about g of lambda and why we can work with this instead of the previous problem that's actually a very large problem that we cannot decompose and approach, g of lambda actually resembles a lot the first formulation that we had. Okay, I mean, this is, you can see it as a constant term, but remember, initially we had here a vol. Now, instead of vol, we have penalization of load shedding at lambda. Lambda is endogenously derived, but g of lambda is a function of lambda, so this is, I mean, when we are approaching this, it is as if it is a constant. It can be decomposed. You just observed 40-minute presentation, proving that there is a way to tackle this, then for a model as large as the model that has been used for ERA, for example. Okay, so what we recommend, what we will be implementing, we will use the subgradient method in order to find the lambda that maximizes g of lambda. Okay, so let's see how this looks. So assume that this is your g of lambda, star is your optimal solution. So the black line is, let's say, my ultimate upper bound to this problem. The purple dot being a solution to g of lambda for a given lambda. The purple line is always a lower bound to my optimal solution. So I define as optimality gap the difference between of my lower bounds of my current solution to the optimal. And what the subgradient method does, it would be updating lambda so that we move from here to there, to there, to there, to there. Gradually, the optimality gap is diminishing, and we are approaching closer to our solution. Okay, so let's put this in an algorithm. So we provide initial values for lambda. It can be anything. It can be 0. It can be very low. Of course, the closer you are to your optimal, to what it should be, the lower the iterations it will be required. So for every lambda, we solve this g of lambda. So we will be solving a capacity expansion with lambda being the penalization of load shedding. We know every solution is a lower bound to our problem. So we will be comparing for convergence. If it's achieved, great. If not, we will be updating lambdas using the subgradient method. I repeat. So okay, I'm gonna, let's see every one of these parts, how we deal with them. So okay, how we update lambda with the subgradient method. If rho is the subgradient of g of lambda to lambda, and I remind you here, what was the expression, so you can actually see that the subgradient is actually my limit violation, the violation of my constraint. So every time I solve this problem, I retrieve the information of what is my limit violation, and then I can use it for the subgradient to update lambda. Alpha is a step size. We're using the poly-X step size, meaning that it is the upper bound, ideally the optimal upper bound, I mean the actual star, minus the lower bound, which is the objective value I retrieve with every iteration, over norm square of subgradient. So this is how we work. As I said, ideally, this would be the optimal. This would be the actual, but of course we don't know that, so we have to get a very good estimation of what is our upper bound. So let's see how we deal with this. How to find an upper bound. So again, here the picture that I showed you before, assume that we have solved GL and we have a trial solution. Now, every solution is infeasible for the primal problem. Why? G of lambda is penalizing the violation of the constraint, but there is a violation of the constraint. So every solution we get from the G of lambda, except for the optimal, it's violating the constraint. So if we had a process to recover feasibility, what would happen then? We know actually that every feasible solution, the objective value of every feasible solution is actually an upper bound to our problem, right? And maybe as closer as we are to the star, the less feasibility recovery is required, so our upper bound would be gating further down and would be a better estimation. So, okay, if we are able to recover feasibility, then we have an acceptable upper bound. So how to do this? I mean, at first, at least my intuition was, okay, I have a given set of investments already from this trial solution. Maybe I can fix this for the main problem and try to solve my initial problem with some elements fixed, so it will be easier to solve. But it's not a good idea to work with the primal problem at all. So instead, we're introducing a heuristic. So the idea is we will be gradually adding capacity of a specific technology. I'm leaving this a little bit general here, but we can talk about it more, until there is no violation of the constraint. So let's see how this will work. So assume this is my solution, the load shedding from the solution I have. Assume that there is a limit violation of 52.5 spread across 35 hours. Okay, so how much capacity I need to add? I mean, okay, the least I can say is, okay, divide, I will be adding 1,500 megawatts. If I say, okay, I add this and I have it working to cover load shedding for sure, my load shedding would be decreasing. Okay, I still have some limit violation, so I repeat the process. Okay, I add 962 more, violation will be further reduced until I reach 0. Okay, so I have a heuristic telling me that, okay, if I had approximately 3 giga of additional capacity, I could bring down my, I could reach a feasible solution, not the optimal, but it would be enough to have a feasible solution. So I can use this information in order to get an upper bound. Okay. So moving now to the most computationally intensive part of the process, so actually solving the capacity expansion for lambda. Daniel presented Daniel's work. It mentioned in the end actually had 2 contributions. It had the second stage relaxation, on which he focused a lot in his presentation. He was also utilizing the subgradient method. He introduced a way to use the subgradient method to tackle this. I'm actually using the subgradient method for this, and it is, let's say, within the scope of continuing this work to also implement the second stage relaxation that Daniel has proposed. So I'm going to be tackling this using the subgradient method, so you're going to see how this works. So reminder, this is the problem that we need to tackle. We will be rewriting it using these functions v. So these terms have now, the second stage has gone here, so now we can actually solve. What we do is for a given x, we solve the scenario specific problems. We solve the v x comma w, and from the solution we obtain an interesting amount. This is the dual These mu's are the dual, the shadow prices of the power generation constraints, and they are useful because we can use them to find a subgradient here along the x-axis. So this is how we implement the subgradient method to tackle this. Okay, so we basically have a subgradient method within a subgradient method. So we have a loop within a loop. Let's see a little bit what this looks like, this inner loop, just to have the algorithm complete. So first of all, we need to initialize. We have to have an initial x to start. I'm going to explain what is the initialization process that we use. We also require to have a lower bound. Same way as before we needed an upper bound, now we need a lower bound. We solve the scenario-specific problems. We update x and proceed. So for the initialization process, basically what we used, we will use the wait-and-see solution. The wait-and-see solutions, it's going to be a lower bound to the problem. So this is how we deal with this. And the reason basically why we require the lower bound is because we use the poly X step size. So again, it's necessary. It's a necessary step to take. Okay, and we can also initialize X based on this. Okay. So this is not a trivial process in general. The good thing about it is that we can parallelize sub-processes. So solving the scenario-specific models is achieved in a parallelization, let's say, scheme. And this makes the whole process quite efficient. The challenging part, first of all, initialization can be time-consuming. Second of all, in general, the subgradient method requires a lot of iterations to converge. I mean, I don't know if you remember from Daniel's graph, but it was not getting at a very good point, and at least not as fast as the algorithm that Daniel has proposed. So until we attempt this implementation, let's see what we do here in order to somehow accelerate the process, because you can imagine it as an iteration within an iteration. So we cannot let it evolve forever, especially if we require a lot of iterations to find lambda. So, okay, this is how the inner loop, how GeoVal evolves with iterations. So you see that, okay, it is going down, but I mean, this part relative to this part, actually the difference is small, and we empirically observed by let's say making tests with the model in smaller scales, where we could actually calculate the extended form solution of G of lambda. We found that if we stop at a level, if we stop earlier here, for example, this introduces an error, but actually the error is really, really small, and we were very, very close. I mean, the difference of stopping here with the actual G of lambda in our test was of the order of 0.01%. So it was really, we are tackling this by ending a little bit earlier. Okay, so let's move on to the case studies. So we are using the error context. We're basically using the same context that Daniel used for his approach. So 56 nodes across Europe, 35 climatic scenarios. There is a possibility of both investments and retirements in the actual model that we are running, and there are more constraints than the ones that we saw, constraints on hydro, battery, and there is a possibility, of course, of trade flows. The EENS limits are introduced by node, so there is a separate constraint for every node. And we will work on 4 cases of EENS limits. So the main case, I call it ERA 2021. What we have used here is from the ERA results. Actually, the ERA 2021 had 2 scenarios. One of them was named scenario with capacity mechanism. What the scenario was doing, it was running the EVA, so it was running the capacity expansion step, and then it was assuming that there are capacity mechanisms that add investments in order to meet the national targets. So the results of the scenario on EENS, they are, let's say, coherent with the national targets. So these are the EENS limits that we're imposing in this case. That's why I'm calling it ERA 2021. And actually, this process of adding capacity in order to reach the targets resembles a lot our feasibility recovery that I showed you before. Okay, other cases are zero limits, which provides some interesting insights. So what if we had zero, we allow no load shedding? Cases of low or high limits as percentages of annual demand. We will be comparing two methods. Our approach, which is the explicit consideration of reliability constraint, in which basically it yields endogenous lambda. So we have lambda, it is as if we have an endogenous zone-specific cost of load shedding. So we will compare this to having a standard uniform for all regions value of lost load at 50,000 euros per megawatt hour. This is actually the VRLL used for the era 2021. So we will be comparing the two and see if we can actually get what is the investment plan that they both yield. We're implementing this on the National High Performance Computing Facility areas. So we are able to parallelize the process, and actually we have the computational, let's say, resources to work on a problem as large as this. This relates to the question that was posed before. So in this application, in the results that I'm going to show, we have used one CPU per scenario. This is the minimum number of CPUs because there are 35 scenarios. However, indeed, we can utilize more CPUs, taking advantage of algorithms that can utilize more threads to optimize the same process. However, we're going to be demonstrating the results only for this conservative use of one CPU. So keep in mind that these are, let's say, the ones that take up the most time. Okay, so this is how the algorithm evolves. We have actually started from a very low lambda here. This is the evolution of the upper bound. I'm keeping the best upper bound so far. This is the G of lambda in every iteration, so for the different lambdas, where the subgradient method has led us. This is a quite some big picture. Overall, the achieved optimality gap after approximately 50 iterations was 1.3%. So it was quite satisfactory. So in terms of time, with the conservative use of one CPU, this does take a lot. I mean, one single loop of these 50 iterations took up something less than 2 hours, with initialization of inner loop being rather time consuming. However, what we have observed with tests is, for example, if we take advantage of multi-threading, I mean, if we use 5 CPUs per task, this will be reducing the time by 70%. So it's a non-linear, I mean, it has a negative. I mean, we use 5 CPUs and the time is reduced by 70%, but so that's why we stick with the conservative use of one CPU so that we do not exhaust our quota. But there is, I mean, this can be significantly accelerated. Okay, so let's see the comparison of let's say, solving the capacity expansion with endogenous VRLL of our approach relative to have a uniform VRLL for all zones. So we do actually say it's already visible from the graph that the case of our approach, we are able to reach a solution that satisfies the EENS limits with fewer investments, 30% less investments. It allows for retiring approximately 40% more retirements. The savings in investment cost is important, and in total cost, the savings are of the order of 1.6%. So, I mean, this is a finding that was a bit expected, that we would have savings because we have a specific VRLL for every zone that is it is connected. It has been derived by the fact that we have a constraint, a specific reliability constraint. I have included this picture to show you a little bit. So these lambdas, this endogenous VRLL, there's actually quite a variability in Europe. Of course, it depends a lot on what is the EENS limit that every country has posed. What I find interesting is that when I average these lambdas, They're actually very close to the 15,000 VRLA that the ERA has used. So this is nice because it's like a proof of consistency, at least at the European level, between the VRLA that has been used and the targets, the national targets in the ERA. Okay. So some results of cases with different limits. So this is the case that no load shedding is allowed. So what is interesting for me to note is a bit focusing on this low case, which only allows 0.01% of annual demand to be shed. So even from allowing a little load shedding, we actually require much less investments. I don't have the percentage exactly, but it is almost 2/3. It's almost down by 1/3. And 31 gigawatts less investment from allowing the load shedding at the level of ERA. And again, comparisons of different cases in regard to cost. I wanted to focus a little bit. I will be focusing a little bit more in this graph. So we have attempted with a small number of cases that we have to actually plot how the cost drops by allowing more load shedding. So again, even from allowing a little load shedding, there are savings through the process, considerable ones in total cost. From allowing load shedding at the level of national targets for ERA, 5% savings in total savings. 5% savings in total costs, sorry. Okay, so in conclusion, we have proposed a methodology that solves a large-scale stochastic capacity expansion problem with EENS constraints. We find that there are cost benefits of trying to tackle this instead of accounting for reliability just by including a cost in the objective function. And actually, for our case study, considering the ERA 2021 context, the cost savings were 1.6%. We can observe how different EENS limits impact the system, so some interesting insights can be derived from that. For example, even from allowing a little load sheddings, cost benefits are non-negligible. While going to the level, for example, of ERA 2021, cost savings were of the order of 5%. And finally, what is quite interesting with this approach is that we can retrieve the shadow price of the EENS constraint. So this is a really interesting information, potentially with more insights to be drawn from it. And I would be really happy to working more on it to see what are those. So that's from me. I was actually much faster than I expected, but I hope I didn't rant it. So we need to acknowledge that we're quite privileged to be able to use the ARIS, the cluster, the high performance computing facility, in order to do these runs. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marlena. In the meantime, I've been collecting questions from the audience. Maybe start from Ephthimis. Is there a question you can direct to Marlena? Because I stole your question from the previous session.
No, because it was both. Maybe give the room to the Senate.
Sure. So one interesting question by Panagiotis, also Nikos was wondering about the vol levels. So maybe start from Panagiotis.
Thanks, Panagiotis Andrianessis, BU and Minpari PSL. Nice presentation, Marlena. I have one suggestion and slash question on the methodology. So essentially, you are solving a Lagrangian dual and of a stochastic optimization problem, right? And you are using a subgradient method. I think a more appealing, like computationally efficient method would be to consider like a Dancing-Wolfe decomposition for this type of problem. It's there is some literature from Andy that we've been discussing, like with Anthony from Andy Philpott, for the capacity expansion problem, where essentially they use column generation to solve this problem, and tomorrow we'll discuss about also some details. But this is a technique that is used that applies like to this type of problems, and I think the convergence, I mean, will be better, and also see this practically to converge.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the yes.
You want to react on that, or?
I have a similar question also, but
Yeah.
please.
Okay, please. And maybe, Anthony, the work also on level methods, I mean, could apply to this type
Yeah.
of problems. I mean, like that's essentially solving the Lagrangian dual. I mean, like that's the same problem that we solve for convex hull pricing. And the literature on stochastic programming is much more advanced on this. Yeah. Nicola, you want to follow up?
Yeah, maybe just.
Thanks, Marilena.
Thank you.
So maybe first a clarification question. So is it correct that lambda is one-dimensional?
It has a dimension of the node.
Oh, of the nodes, okay.
I mean,
The bidding zone.
the bidding zones.
Yes, I see. And your function is not piecewise linear. Then the dual, the Lagrangian function is not piecewise linear in your case.
Yeah, why
It is.
not?
I see. Yeah.
Why not? Yeah, it is.
It is piecewise linear, I see. Yeah, so then
Okay.
I would agree with the suggestion of Panas, basically.
Guys, one thing to be explicit, the GL value is a sub-problem. The original problem is coupled in scenarios. It does not obey the structure of cutting plane methods, etc. So you could use it to solve for a given lambda. But the structure here is sum of stuff over scenarios less than or equal to something. So there's not this first stage, and then the first stage decision is the right-hand side to the second stage. There's a summation over scenarios afterwards. I don't know if it affects your ideas, but I think it might.
Yeah, to me, it's still, I mean, you have a function and you want to find a minimum, so
I think it will apply. It's just you have to see the problem from the beginning. From the original problem.
Anyway, offline.
Yeah, what
Yeah, to be taken offline.
So my question is not computational, but it's more, I'm a bit puzzled by the interpretation of the lambda, because I'm, like, the way I'm used to think about it, it is more linked to the LOLE and the time of energy not served, rather than the total quantity of energy not served, because I'm used to look at it from the point of view of the supply side. So at optimality, the number of, like, the cost of new entry of the peaker and the number of hours you're allowed to have curtailment directly sets the value of lost load, because this is the quantity that is needed for the assets to be profitable and to invest. So, like, maybe you can, like, is there, like, how should I think about this this question there? Because it's not exactly the same approach in your case.
No, it's a different approach, and it has to do with, I would say that it is a different way of finding it, and also it cannot, I mean, it is possible to approach it this way because we have an EENS constraint and not a lowly constraint. But it is, I would say that it is a different way to approach it. I don't know if you have another comment, but I think it gives you the information. It gives you the information of what would be the penalization of load shedding that we would incur in certain level of investments in order to meet a certain criteria on ENS, not lowly, because that would be a different problem. But yeah, I would say basically that we arrive at this information, but from a different path.
So basically, I'm wondering what's the difference between the vol that you would get from the LOLE, so if you, from the number or not served, so in which you can, it's actually quite straightforward to get the value of lost load that you are inducing by a certain cost of new entry and a certain number of hours of curtailment, and this approach for finding the vol. Maybe it's better phrased like this than the first time.
Maybe I can.
Okay.
So
I think the formula you have in mind is cone equals vol times lolly. So So that's a super simplified approximation of the optimal solution for a single zone setting. Once you have interacting zones and you pose the same question of what is the optimal expansion subject to some lolly constraints, then there are intricate effects of if you are about to shed load, how do you share that load sharing between different regions? And that identity, which is an approximation of the real problem, stops holding because in a single area, there's no synchronicity issue. There is one area, the peak periods are the ones that correspond to incidence of load shedding, but also energy shed in megawatt hours. When you have multiple areas, dealing with megawatt hours is different from dealing with number of incidents. And it's only the same if there is a coincidence of peak loads. So things become more complex and the nice identity stops holding. And what we acknowledge is we don't cope with the lolly constraints, but we can cope with the energy reliability constraints. And that's all we can say at this stage, if that makes sense. Maybe, Nikos, I pass the microphone to you for an interesting question you have.
Yes, Nikos Fridas from Grant Thornton. Well, you know, this is a real problem in Greece we are facing at the moment, and it's going to become very hot political debate as well, because the operators of the existing combined cycle plants threaten basically to decommission their plants and sell whatever scrap value or transfer their machines to Africa or whatever, and the ones that are in the process of constructing the new generation of 800 megawatt, they say that we have been promised capacity payments, but these have not been realized. The 2021 adequacy study of ADMIE, I think, has not shown the need for CRM. So there are many issues here that they are interacting. One issue, of course, was that, okay, if you are providing flexibility as you claim, then obviously in the balancing market and scarcity pricing, you can recover this sunk cost or whatever, since obviously in the day-ahead markets you cannot anymore recover with more and more zeros. Now, again, the environment changes by the day, because every day there is a new idea about how we will integrate storage. Now they're talking about free for all, 3.5 gigawatt of storage, some of which is already supported. Of course, this cannibalizes the balancing price. They have received subsidies, the batteries, and the CCGT say, you know, this does not exist anymore, scarcity pricing. But my question is, I don't know if you have, you know, because you said that the model, the expansion planning adds capacity based on capacity payments until we meet the targets. But this is theoretical, it's not realistic what the market will decide to invest.
Yes.
The targets will come if there is viability of the investments. Anyhow, what about sub-day-ahead issues with regards to viability of plants? Has this?
No, it has not. This has not been.
But this is the issue, the
This has
flexibility, and this is where they say you have to pay us because you may show long-term adequacy is okay, but you know during sunset the ramping rates are not there.
But do we have ramp?
No.
We don't have ramp rates anymore.
It is where they make their argument. And it's going to be so it's very relevant, your study, and you need to follow the developments. It's very hot political issue.
EVA.
Because ERA study of ADMIE has shown adequacy is okay, and the government is not willing to provide these capacity payments. And there is a threat by the CCGT operators, which is based on these short-term issues, the flexibility gap. As you say, you don't, this, you know, this...
No, because this, I mean, it's, let's say on a theoretical level, and it uses the model as used from as used for the EVA. But I'm quite thankful for the proposition on where to try to implement it as a next step. So I think this is very valuable. Yes, but this is a theoretic, yes.
Commercial realities are unfortunately slightly different, and we are in a kind of.
Theoretic as what answer is that?
But I mean,
And of course, also we need to also in this kind of studies derate capacity, because of course some capacity is more firm than other capacity.
yes, yes. Yeah, great. Thank you.
I propose we thank Marilena and take me out of the plan. 1 hour.